We can sense the allure of gaining knowledge of good and evil, and the narrator heightens the tension by noting how the woman can already see that the fruit is good. So we have to wonder that if she can already see what is good, then what more could she want except to learn what is evil? Well, the woman eats the fruit, as does the man. And what they experience with their newfound knowledge is shame. Shame at being naked. They conceal their nakedness by creating garments made of leaves. They conceal themselves by hiding in the garden. And the positive relationships are now disrupted. When God asks the man what happened, he blames the woman. When God asks the woman what happened, she blames the serpent. So at every turn, relationships turn sour. And this change is reflected in the negative judgment of God. He says the woman's hostility toward the serpent will be ongoing, and the mutuality of women and men will give way to male domination. Humanity's relationship to the earth is affected as the soil becomes infested with thistles and thorns. Work will become hard labor until people die and return to the dust from which they were taken. The story ends when people know the difference between good and evil. Yet God recognizes that knowing what is good does not mean doing what is good. He assumes they'll reach beyond the limits again and take from the tree of life to seize immortality for themselves. So God sends them out of the garden, away from the tree of life. And he stations an angel there with a flaming sword to prevent them from returning. As literature, this story is set at the dawn of time. But it's designed to shape perspectives on the world as it is. It shows the contrast between the harmony God intends and the disruption human beings have created. On the one hand, God intends that people care for the earth and its creatures, and that women and men be partners in that work. But on the other hand, the earth and relationships within it have been damaged by human action. So that raises questions about how one should respond. Are people simply to resign themselves to the damage that's occurred? Or are they to recommit themselves to the vision of what God intends life to be? In the biblical narrative, the destructive patterns persist in chapter 4. In the story of Cain and Abel, they are two sons of Adam and Eve, and their relationship is destroyed by jealousy. It says that Abel was a shepherd who offered a lamb in sacrifice to God, and Cain was a farmer who offered grain. It says God was pleased with Abel's offering, but was not pleased with Cain's, and we're never told why. Now, interpreters have tried to fill in that gap in the narrative by trying to explain why God acted this way. But the story itself doesn't say. Instead, it says that God told Cain that sin is lurking at the door and trying to control him, so the challenge is to overcome it. This is the moment in the story that fascinated the novelist John Steinbeck, who wrote the book East of Eden. It's a story about people in California in the early 20th century. But the title recalls this part of Genesis, when people must struggle with evil in a world that is no longer the Garden of Eden. At one point, they discuss what God's words to Cain actually meant. The issue was, how many options did Cain have? And was it up to him to decide? In the biblical account, Cain gives in and kills his brother. But for Steinbeck, the key moment was before that, when things still hung in the balance. Steinbeck said, there's one story in the world, and only one, which both frightens and inspires us. People are caught in their lives, in their thoughts, in their hungers and ambitions, in a net of good and evil. And the question is how they will respond. That was the question that Genesis 4 raised for Steinbeck. And through his own writing, he invited readers to make it their own. I want to turn now to the third part of the text, which asks how God will respond to this disintegration of harmony. Genesis chapters 6 through 9 tell the story of Noah and the flood. And culturally, it's become a favorite in children's literature. When the story is told for children, the plot is usually simplified into a few major elements. It begins when God warns Noah that a great flood is coming. So Noah has to build a huge boat or ark to save all the animals. And that's where the action begins, with Noah gathering pairs of animals from all the species of earth. Now, Genesis does not actually list all the animals that Noah gathers, but artists have had no trouble filling in the details. They might picture a great procession of animals going into the ark 2 by 2. Typical scenes include giraffes and zebras, goats and lions. They're followed by sheep and deer, horses and oxen. And all the while the thunderclouds are forming as birds fly around overhead. Well, in Genesis, the drama continues as the rain comes down for 40 days and 40 nights until the water covers the earth. The flood rises up to enormous depth until even the mountaintops vanish under the waves. But the ark floats safely on the water for months until the rain stops, and as the waters go down, the ark comes to rest on the mountains. Noah opens a window, and he sends out a raven and then a dove to look for dry land. The first time, the dove brings back nothing. The second time, it brings back an olive branch. Then the third time, the dove does not return. It's flown away as a signal that it's nearly time for everyone to leave the ark. When they finally do go out, a rainbow appears, and we learn that the rainbow is a sign that God will never again send a flood. So in its basic outline, it's a wonderful story of deliverance and renewal. But when you look at the story more closely, it becomes more troubling. And the major issue is that it's God who brings the disaster, which seems inexplicable. After all, Genesis introduces God as the creator who brings life into being. So for God to send the flood means the creator has become the destroyer, which is hard to comprehend. In the simplified version, all attention focuses on Noah and the animals who ride safely in the ark. But in Genesis itself, we look outside the ark at the people and animals who drown in the deluge. It's a terrifying scene. And when we ask how the Creator could do such a thing, there's no easy answer. But asking the question does draw us more deeply into the story. And there we find that the portrayal of God is surprisingly complex. In chapter 6, verse 5, the story starts with grief, with divine grief. God created the world to be good, but he sees that human beings have given in to evil and are ruining everything. So we have a startling picture of God coming to regret that he ever created humankind, and that's why he decides to blot them out. Yet this creates a dilemma for God. Simply blotting out all life would turn the Creator into the destroyer. So this is where Noah comes in. When God commands Noah to save the animals, we see destruction linked to renewal. And renewal preserves a thread of continuity in the narrative. We've seen that earlier God created life of all sorts. The birds and animals, the people and the things that creep along the ground. And earlier, God directed human beings to tend to the well-being of creation. So this happens again here. God directs Noah to tend the well-being of creation by building an ark, not only to save himself, but to preserve and renew all the species of life on earth. The gift of the rainbow at the end of the story, then, signals God's renewed commitment to the well-being of creation. In chapter 9, God puts his bow in the clouds as a sign of his covenant, not only with human beings, but with all the birds and animals too. The rainbow is a sign that God will never destroy the earth by a flood again. It's a sign of his commitment to the well-being of all living things. Now, it's interesting that the Hebrew text of Genesis refers to the rainbow simply as a bow, or in Hebrew, a keshet. It's the common word for a bow that a warrior would use in battle. You see the bow depicted as a weapon in ancient art. By hanging his bow in the clouds, God is hanging up his weapon. It's a reminder that his will for the world is ultimately not conflict, but life. Yet this brings us to the fourth part of the story, where there's one more complication in the plot. The rainbow may show that God is committed to peaceful relations with the world, but that does not mean that human beings share that commitment. And in chapter 11, we find people posing a challenge to God in the story of the Tower of Babel. The story centers on the use and abuse of the power to communicate. As it begins, all people speak the same language. They use the same words, and the question is how they will use that power to communicate. Now, at the beginning of this lecture, we found God using words to create things. In Genesis 1, God speaks and brings life into being. It's by speaking that God brings harmony into the world. But in the story of Babel, the power to communicate takes a negative turn. Here people use speech to help them build a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens. In this context, the story continues the theme of human beings trying to reach beyond their appropriate limits. The theme was introduced when people ate the forbidden fruit in the garden in the hope of becoming like God in their knowledge of good and evil. Now in the story of Babel, people again try to reach beyond their limits with this tower extending to heaven. And their intent is to establish a name for themselves. It's portrayed as human arrogance. So God intervenes by disrupting their power to communicate. He confuses their speech so they no longer understand what the others are saying. And that brings the project to an end. Here again, the writer has fun with language. He refers to the project itself as Bab El. In Hebrew, Bab El means gate of God, because the tower was supposed to reach God's own heaven. But the writer comments that the project actually becomes Balal, which in Hebrew means to confuse. So Bab El becomes Balal. The attempt to reach the gate of God disintegrates into confusion. And people are scattered from there, across the face of the whole earth. Now, it's intriguing to ask what people might see in this story, because their perspectives do differ. For some, it's a kind of folk tale. It's a way of explaining why we have so many different languages. But others discern a social critique. You see, the name Babel, or Babel, is the Hebrew name for the city we know as Babylon. And Babylon was the center of an ancient empire that eventually conquered the kingdom of Judah and carried its people into exile. The Babylonians, like others in the region, built cities with temples shaped like towers or pyramids. Those temples were thought to connect earth with heaven. So for readers of that time, the biblical story may have been a critique of the religious beliefs that supported Babylonian rule. Still others read the story as a commentary